Okay, got it. And so, for example, right now, recently, we're in the process of a shift. We're sort of on the border, on the cusp of a shift, depending on which calculation method you use. Where, for example, in the 1980s, we had a conjunction in air in Libra, and there's going to be one more conjunction in air in 2020. But we're in the process of, I think, getting out of that and shifting to Earth?
Well, and this is where the mean conjunctions versus true conjunctions comes in. In the old original theory, in the tropical zodiac, some astrologers use a modified sidereal zodiac. But if you follow the tropical zodiac, then we are already in air. We shifted into the airy triplicity in 2000.
Okay, right. So we're going from, it's been in Earth for the past 200 some odd years, and now we're getting ready to shift, or we have shifted into air.
Yes. The shift to Earth was in 1802, and the shift into air was in 2000. Now that is using what's called a mean conjunction, and that was one of those important learning curves that I mentioned. It's the difference between something that is a mean and something that is true. And this is from Ptolemaic astronomy. It's not something we have anymore, but it's actually a fascinating topic. And you have to use these mean conjunctions in order to generate these triplicity series. So
sure. This is something that came up, I think, at the AFA conference. That was something that people were really interested in, which was your statement that typically the shifts from one triplicity to the other were calculated with the mean conjunctions, which are based on Ptolemaic astronomy. And then there was this underlying question that came up then at that point of, if it was based on Ptolemaic astronomy, which involves astronomical things that are no longer seen to be valid, such as epicycles, for example, then is there a way that it's still a valid phenomenon, or is it something that's perhaps not relevant anymore in this time frame?
Right. Well, let's talk about what mean and true conjunctions are to explain this, because people need to ask themselves, should we be doing this? So when I was first learning this theory, the official idealized theory of 12 conjunctions per triplicity every 20 years and so on, I went to my computer program and printed out the ephemeris of all the Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions for the past few centuries. And what did I find? That in the ephemeris, not only were there not 12 in each triplicity, but sometimes there might only be 9 conjunctions in a triplicity, and then maybe it would shift to the next element, and then it would shift back, and for maybe 8, and it was all over the place, and I couldn't even tell where any triplicity really began, much less identify 12 of them. The reason is because your ephemeris, your book ephemeris and your computer ephemeris, and any chart that you look at, these give what are called true positions. And in Ptolemaic astronomy, if something is a true value, it means as observed from Earth. So when you look at a chart or in your ephemeris and you see that Jupiter and Saturn are conjoining exactly, then you should be able to walk outside and look in the night sky and see Jupiter and Saturn conjoined right there. Because as astrologers, what we are interested in are the true positions. Mm-hmm. Where do they appear to us in the zodiac? So that's a true position. Ptolemy's astronomy there was kind of a two-step process when you calculated a planet's position. The first thing you did was you found what was called its mean position. And this was the position of the planet as measured from a spot out in space where the planet would seem to move at a constant rate. And what you did was then you applied a correction called an equation. And when you applied that correction, that would give you the true position. In other words, the ephemeris was calculated for a point out in space from which the planet would appear to move at a constant rate. And then you'd add a correction that would shift the perspective to the Earth. And that would tell you where the planet truly was. So what a mean conjunction is, in fact, the mean position of these planets is where the centers of their epicycles are. So a mean conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter is a conjunction of the centers of their epicycles. So if you looked up in the heavens, if there was a mean conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter, you would look up into the heavens, and if their circles and epicycles could glow in the dark, you would look up in the night sky, you would see the center of Jupiter's epicycle, and then just beyond that you would see the center of Saturn's, and just behind them you would see the part of the zodiac that they are conjoined in.
Okay.
They themselves, the bodies of Saturn and Jupiter, because they rotate on their epicycles, they might be elsewhere in the sky. Saturn might be direct and about to retrograde, so he might be far off to the left. And maybe Jupiter is retrograde and about to go direct, and he's off far to the right. So that their bodies are not actually conjoined. There isn't a true conjunction. But because the centers of their epicycles are conjoined, they are in a mean conjunction.
So what it is kind of like an average in a sense.
Yeah, and in fact, that's exactly what the center of the epicycle does, is it measures the average position.
Okay.
And now this all sounds really strange to people, but there's a very easy way to explain how this works. And it's simply this. Ptolemy had to explain two types of data. First, he had to explain the fact that the planets, on average, moved around the zodiac at a certain rate. And that is what we normally call their planetary period. So that's approximately 30 years for Saturn, approximately 12 for Jupiter. And then they move forwards and backwards, direct and retrograde. Well, all Ptolemy did was he put their cyclic zodiacal motion on a big circle and put their retrograde motion on a little circle, the epicycle, and made each of those circles turn exactly once for their cycles. So the center of Jupiter's epicycle will rotate all around the zodiac exactly once in his tropical period. And he will rotate around his epicycle exactly once in between retrogradations. So the idea of using the center of their epicycles is based on a real number.
Right. It's based on basically the average number or the idealized number of their actual cycles.
Yeah. For Jupiter, it's 11.86 years. That's a real number. You can go onto NASA's website, and they will have that number as the tropical cycle for Jupiter. It's a real number, a real cycle. What Ptolemy did was that he defined what kind of circle would rotate at that rate. And the point that rotates is the center of their epicycle.
Okay.
So sorry, go on.
I mean, so the way that this is relevant, I think, to astrologers today, or the reason why, somebody that, let's say, is a modern astrologer that's just coming in and wants to learn this technique, why they might want to think about this is like I think people's initial reaction upon hearing that the mean conjunctions are calculated involving epicycles, which is kind of like a rejected astronomical theory at this point, they might immediately then jump to a conclusion and think that they should reject the idea of using the mean conjunction because it doesn't represent the true or the actual positions of the planets, and instead it represents this more idealized position that may or may not be accurate. But so this raises a question then. There may actually be still a valid reason to use the mean conjunction because it does represent an actual sort of idealized cycle, in the same way as if people are familiar with other types of planetary periods that were used in Hellenistic or medieval astrology, such as the lesser years of the planets, like the 8-year cycle of Venus or the 15-year cycle of Mars or what have you, that those are actually very useful, practical periods of time to use and to work with that can be very good to use as actual techniques. So it's actually not a given that you should immediately reject this technique just because it doesn't perfectly fit the true or the literal positions of the planets.
Right. I mean, if you think that other planetary cycles have timing value and interpretive value, then there's no reason not to look at mean conjunction cycles, because those are based on those very same planetary periods. One thing that they were doing was they were using these conjunctions as structuring devices. I mean, like I said, if you look in the ephemeris over a number of centuries, you might not be able to tell what. You can tell that the Saturn and Jupiter are trying to cluster in a certain triplicity, but because there are so many true conjunctions that happen outside of that, you might not be able to see the underlying structure that they're expressing.
Sure.
Because they go direct and they go retrograde. So if you recognize that the planets go retrograde, then you might say, well, were it not for the fact that they go retrograde, they would have conjoined properly in this triplicity in the first place. So what the mean conjunctions do is they help to structure periods of history, even though we know the bodies of the planets aren't there.
Sure.
Now, not every astrologer agreed with the use of mean conjunctions, and one important astronomer and astrologer was named Al-Battani, and he did not agree with using mean conjunctions. He thought that you needed to look at the place where the planets actually were in the signs, their true positions, and he wanted to look at true conjunctions that happened within a couple of days of eclipses. So he wanted to bring the Persian Saturn-Jupiter conjunctions together with Ptolemaic eclipses, and he thought that only the true conjunctions were the good ones.
Okay,
and that's certainly a way you could go.